Okay, we good? Good afternoon, everyone. All right, good, let's wake up. So this is the famous, or I think I should say the infamous panel that comes right before the cocktail hour. So we are sitting between you and the full bar behind you. So we're gonna try to make this as interactive as possible and engaging as possible. So with that, what I wanted to first start with is a short story, or very, very short story. So when I was in grad school, I remember talking to one of my professors, who was actually Jeff Sachs, some of you may know, and he said, listen, life is very short. Spend your time working on the big issues, the big challenges of the day. And I think that's why we're all here. I mean, this has been an incredible day. The content has been amazing. We're really dealing with the biggest issues of the day. And also, I just want to congratulate the Crane Shares team for really putting this together. It's really been an amazing day. So thanks for that. And what bigger issue can there be at the moment than climate change? This is really the largest existential challenge that we face. In the last 3 weeks, in the last 3 or 4 weeks, we've had a few things come out. First, the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is all of the world's leading scientists on climate, have basically come out and said, essentially, we are on track for an unsustainable, unlivable planet within our children's lifetime. Right? And this is not something that is so forward that we have time to worry about it. They're also saying we've got to get moving very fast, rapidly cutting emissions now, right? So that happened about 3 weeks ago. The SEC published disclosure guidelines for companies, required disclosure guidelines. So this has been, a really big deal. India. So I don't know how many of you are tracking the heat wave in India. March was the hottest month in recorded history in India. It's been over 45 degrees Celsius. We're on track for, in the next 10 years, for large parts of the planet to become unlivable. All right? So this is not a 10-year, 20-year problem that we have to solve. This is a problem that we have to solve right now. And there is great thematic connectivity to what we were talking about earlier, which is China, right? China, second largest economy in the world, the largest greenhouse gas emitter in the world. So there is no solution to climate change without China. There's no solution to climate change, obviously, without the US. And so let me start. We'll get the blood moving a bit. Let me ask a few questions by a show of hands. How many people in the audience here have purchased a carbon offset for travel or for your annual emissions, by a show of hands? Okay. And how many have invested either in their personal account or professionally in a carbon market? Okay, nice. And how many would you say have gone into a deep dive in carbon markets? Okay, fewer. That's great. So listen, I think in 5 minutes or less, I wanted to do a quick who, what, when, where of carbon markets. The first thing I want to say is we are in this post-Paris Agreement environment. What does that mean? The Paris Agreement is the way the Paris Agreement works is it recognizes the global politics, that the UN doesn't have a enforcement mechanism, and so it relies on action at the member state level. And so what it says is every country needs to be acting on climate change, doing what they can do to address climate change, and report to us every few years through these things called nationally determined commitments. What that means from a carbon markets perspective is that the Paris Agreement actually encourages the use of carbon markets and carbon pricing in countries' responses to climate change. And so we've got lots of action happening at the national level, at country level, new carbon markets coming online all the time. And so why? Why carbon price? So let's step back. Why use a price on carbon, right? And it's quite simply, it's not a silver bullet, it's not the only tool, but it is perhaps the single most important tool we have in the quiver of addressing climate change. And why is that? Because it has knock-on effects on pricing throughout the economy. It changes, it increases the economic return for the things that we want, renewables, energy efficiency, and it makes the things we want to discourage more expensive, right? Emitting hydrocarbons. So that's the why. It's an important tool. And how? So how is typically through a cap and trade program. So we now have about 40% of greenhouse gas emissions in the world covered by some form of carbon price, either implemented or very close to being implemented. And typically these carbon cap and trade programs work with the greenhouse gas emissions in a economy are capped and they go down over time. And then a new asset, a new physical right is created called a carbon allowance. And those allowances can be traded among companies that are facing a compliance obligation. So the idea is to use the market mechanism for what it's good at, efficiency, resource allocation, valuation, in the service of solving a climate challenge. And so where is this happening? So it's happening, as I said, in lots of places in the world, including China, which has just recently launched a national carbon pricing system. But the four biggest, most liquid markets are in the EU, by far the largest, the EU emissions trading system. Right here in California, in the UK, which has just come out of the European market, and in the northeast of the US, the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. Those are the largest, most liquid markets. And this is a fairly young market. In many ways, we're still at the beginning. So the European market started trading in 2005, California in 2013. Really, we think that, the way I think about this, from an investor's perspective, really all portfolios, all investments are exposed to climate change, both the risk associated, the physical risk of climate change, the financial risk associated with the potential regulation, and the opportunities associated with, let's say, investments in clean energy or cars or et cetera. And when I think about carbon pricing and investing in carbon pricing, the way I think about it is an investment in climate action. Because from my perspective, putting a price on carbon is, as I say, not the only thing we can do, but perhaps the single most effective or the single most important thing we can do, systemic tool that we have. We've been talking about this concept of a carbon short squeeze, which suggests that we know that right now, if we're going to achieve the goals of the Paris Agreement, which are to stay well below 1.5 degrees of warming, we're at about 1 to 1.2 now. We need a price of probably about $100 to $200 per ton. Right? If you look at KRBN now, it's at about $45 to $50 per ton. So we're still a long way away from a global price where we know we need it to be to achieve the mid-century net zero targets. The longer we wait to properly price carbon, the higher that eventual price is going to have to be once we get on track. So this is the concept of the carbon short squeeze. So with that, let me pause and introduce the panel. We've got a great panel of experts here. We actually had one panelist who had to drop out last night. He had a fever, JP Brisson. Not sure if it's COVID yet. He's getting tested, but unfortunately he wasn't able to join us. But let me first bring up Luke, who you've already met from CraneShares, head of climate investing at CraneShares, and an old friend, carbon market veteran, Josh Margolis, who's been involved. We were just talking earlier. He started in environmental markets back in can I say, or does that date you? 1985, and he ran one of the first carbon brokerages in the world, Cantor CO2, Cantor Fitzgerald. So Josh has got a long-term perspective on this. So I'm going to sit down here, and the idea is to keep this conversational, and then we'll open up for 10 minutes of questions at the end. So welcome. So Josh, tell us a little bit about how you got into this market, how you got involved in carbon markets. And given the sort of the long time horizon that you've been involved, and you've seen a lot of changes. We've gone through, some people are calling this carbon 2.0. Explain how you've seen the market evolve to a certain extent, and where you see the opportunities today, and also how investors have accessed this market over the last 20 years.
You bet. Aaron, first of all, thanks very much for the opportunity to join you up here, and congratulations to your foresight, to your wisdom, your courage to stand out there in the marketplace, and to work with CraneShares to launch KRBN. If people talk about democratizing access to the markets and enabling investors to take part, and you heard a lot about tokens and coins, et cetera, and this is, I think, the best way for an investor to participate, and to do so in a way that involves acquiring a portfolio, which allows you to gain exposure, and manage the risk associated with that portfolio. So how did I get involved? I mean, I've been on the bloody edge for my career, it seems, in the environmental marketplace, starting back, as you point out, in '85. But even going back before that, my father and I remember vividly walking down the streets of New Hampshire, picking up trash on Earth Day, and my father said to me, "Look, dude, you're here not because you're smart, because you're intelligent, or because of your good looks. You're here but for the fortune of those who went before you." And to much that's been given, much is expected. There was the stewardship concept. Having been involved in the environmental marketplace for as long as I have, I've seen how these markets have changed. And the idea, as you said, is to put a price to make expensive the wrong actions, to make attractive the right actions. And what we've seen is that each marketplace, the marketplace that we see now is as you pointed out, there's California, Quebec, there's the UK, there's the Korea, there's New Zealand, there's Switzerland, the EU ETS. So there are markets that are growing around the world. We don't have a single price, in part because we have a market that has evolved over time. Each marketplace that we see has grown, thankfully, based upon the experiences of the markets that came before. The carbon market stands on the shoulders of the acid rain market. The acid rain market stands on the shoulders of the non-attainment NOx and SOx and particulates and VOC markets. And there are ecosystem marketplaces for wetlands and such. But these markets share a common characteristic. For them to work, for them to have a place where we can say this is a tool, there are some critical elements that we have to see. And those critical elements for environmental performance, for economic performance, for investor performance. And that, those elements are pretty straightforward, and they go out through history. We need to have a cap. China it's been said that nothing happens successfully in climate without China. And that's a true statement. If everything that we do in the rest of the world is right, and China doesn't get it right, then it's for naught. Right? So China has to get it right. And one of the things that I'd like to see, that I hope that China does get to do, is that it gets to impose a cap. Actually a physical and absolute cap. Having worked in the environmental marketplaces for brokerage and consulting firms, and for supporting the work of Environmental Defense Fund in China, working with the 7 initial provinces and cities that did the pilots, one of the things that you see in these pilots, and you now see in the national ETS, is the need for a cap. You need to have a government authority that has the ability to monitor and enforce and actually ensure that they are doing what they do well, which is ensuring that the industries who are subject to the cap and trade program are performing, are reducing emissions, are monitoring effectively, are providing data that actually makes sense and that is verified. So a cap, a government authority. You need to have a banking mechanism, one that allows you to take actions now to reduce emissions now and into the future, and to know that you don't have to liquidate them as soon as you deliver them to the marketplace, that you can store them and deliver them in the future. A trading mechanism, as you pointed out, you have small companies, large companies. You have one of the aspects of emissions trading that makes it work best is if you have a diversity of sources, small, large, expensive, steel, cement, electroplating, cars, a diversity of sources that have different control costs, right? So if you have a trading mechanism, you have an ability to seek out the lowest cost solution. Yeah, we want a price on carbon, but we want that price, frankly, to be as low as possible in order to deliver the environmental benefits, because when the price goes down, ambition can go up, right? So a cap, a government authority, banking, trading mechanism, we need to have offsets. Offsets are reductions that are created outside of the program. Offsets are from reductions that come from agricultural operations, from planting trees, from preserving trees. You think about the carbon sinks. Our problem is going to be made much worse if we don't stop deforestation, if we don't find a way to reverse deforestation. Right? So we have to preserve these forest sinks, and if we give people incentives to invest, not just by allowances, not just to make reductions internally, right? But to give them incentives to invest outside of the programs, that will bring the cost down, right? So those are some of the elements that I think are necessary, and you see these through history from the first cap and trade programs, which were focused on non-attainment pollutants, to ecosystems, to wetlands, to now to carbon, and you see it to the UK ETS, the EU ETS, and in China, and the evolving programs that we're looking at. So that's what I'd like to see in terms of programs that make sense, delivering environmental results, economic results, and co-benefits that allow us to say, to elect politicians. The politicians support these programs. They need to have an ability to say, look what I did. I delivered results. I deliver results to the voters who are going to vote me back into office. If I deliver results to you, which includes clean jobs, a just transition, I'm going to help you transition from your current high carbon economy to a low carbon economy. And I'm going to retrain you. I'm going to give you a transition on an off-ramp, right? And I'm going to deliver benefits 30 years down the road. That's going to allow me to get elected, and that's going to allow me to continue the cap and trade program.
That's great. There's so much in there to unpack. You know, one of the things you said earlier was a single a price on carbon, right? And we're now in the post-Paris world. Before Paris, we were in the Kyoto world, and part of the, you know, the dream of economists, and at least at some point, the dream of the Kyoto regime was, can we have a single global price on carbon? Because that can really drive efficiencies. It can make make the market really globally investable. We're in a different paradigm, right? We're in 1,000 flowers blooming. We've got, you said, we've got Korea, we've got China, we've got RGGI, we've got California. And I think one of the reasons that we created KRBN was because it's confusing to invest in all those markets. And so the idea of a single global, a reference price for a single price on carbon, I think from my perspective was really important. And Luke, maybe coming to you on this idea, you know, why is that important, and why are investors interested in investing in carbon markets?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things. One is what's important and what isn't important. And strangely, maybe it might differ to you, I don't think it's important necessarily, or it's not a priority that we have one global price. It's as long as each price in its jurisdiction is having impact, that California is solving its problem with its price, Europe's solving their problem with their price. And as long as each market is addressing their problem and none of them are making enough progress, but they're moving in the right direction, and we need to accelerate that. So the price being the same isn't that important, but as an investor, as a global investor looking to get exposure to those markets, it's very complicated to know what are the different risks, what are the different demand-supply dynamics. So to create something, as you did in the index with IHS Markit, that gives you the global price of compliance carbon, that's what the KRBN is built on. So it does simplify it. So if people want to get long carbon, there is a very simple tool that you can buy anywhere you can buy equities that gives you that single global price. So that simplifies it, and based on liquidity and kind of democratically allocates across those markets and supports all of them. So I think that's really important. And that's the main thing. But as for how, taking this from the impact side into an investment side, of course, there is a lot of impact. You're supporting these markets. And we can talk a little bit, you mentioned at the beginning, we've launched an offset fund. So the offsets versus the compliance markets, maybe we'll dig into that a little bit. But the fact that these are markets that are growing in interest, you can almost think of them as being long regulation or long the desire to decarbonize. And we all know that. That not only is where we're going, it has to happen. So as we are, you mentioned the short squeeze. The world is short carbon. We've been burning oil and coal for 100 years, and we've never done anything about the carbon it's created. We have to pay for that now. And so we're going to see tightening prices on carbon. So as an investment, there's an asymmetrical sort of risk return there. There's also a lot of functions built into these markets that are designed to make them scarce, make them expensive, to have exactly the economic effect that you mentioned. So you want to be long this market because it's kind of designed to go higher. It's that simple. That said, you get the correlation benefits. It doesn't correlate with anything. You're almost long policy. That operates on a completely different cycle to most other parts of the investment world. And you've got this potentially an inflation hedge. This is going to be the largest rising cost to the global economy, and which should happen. And that means everything's been too cheap. Things are going to start getting a bit more expensive potentially. And this is something, especially if you're looking after retirement assets, you're going to be long something. One that's got this asymmetric return that has low correlations, but it should actually be a hedge to inflation if it is to become something that will feed into inflation. So it's very compelling from a portfolio perspective, let alone how important this is. As you said, it's the most powerful policy tool available.
It's so interesting you mentioned the market design, right? These markets are in many ways designed to go up over time, right? We want, and this is where you have alignment from an investment perspective, but also for an outcome and impact perspective, right? We all want greenhouse gas emissions to get more expensive over time, and these markets are structured in that way. In other words, the cap goes down over time, which creates scarcity. But there were some, and Josh, maybe turning to you also to talk a little bit about the market design and lessons learned. The regulators also don't want the price to go down too much, right? Or to, be that volatile. Right? So maybe talk a little bit about that, but also talk about the nexus between impact and investor returns in these markets, right? What's the correlation or connectivity between a carbon market that delivers the reductions, but also that provides investment opportunities?
Okay, so let's put a stake in the price discussion, and I'm going to come back to it. But first, I'm going to start with the cap. And with your indulgence, I'm going to Dan Niles, I really liked your PowerPoint chart. I envy your ability to create that. But I didn't come with a PowerPoint chart, but I'm going to show you an X and a Y axis, and I'm going to try to do it the best way I know how. If we think about carbon in the context of where we've been, in 1890, we were at 2 billion tons. So I'm trying to get down to 2 billion tons, right? 1890, that's a little while ago. It took us until we got to 1945 to get up to 4 billion tons, right? 4 billion tons. And then by 1973, we got to 16. That was the oil crisis, 16 billion tons. And then if I could jump, I'd go right up here. And we get up to 42 billion tons. That's where we are now, 42 billion tons. And if we go where we are heading right now, we're going to end up at 50 to 70 billion tons. By the time we're going to hit 4.9 degrees Fahrenheit, 4.9 degrees centigrade, about 9 degrees Fahrenheit. So the thing that we need to see happen is a cap. The cap needs to go down, right? So that's what we need to see as a critical element. Now, a price, I'm going to take a little bit of different tack on this. The most successful cap and trade programs are not the ones that drive price up. They're the ones that only make the price as high as it needs to be in order to deliver the results. Now, of course, if we go from 70 billion tons or even 40 billion tons, what we need to do by 2100 is we need to eliminate half of our emissions by 2030, going from 40 to 20 by 2030. We need to zero them out by 2050. And we need to extract 10 to 15 billion tons per year by 2100. Now, you can do the math and say, well, that sounds like the price is going to go down. I would hope that through investments, the ones that are being supported through your portfolio, that we're going to see a revolution in technology, in activity, in psychology, where we're going to see a lower demand for carbon products and a higher demand for Tesla, for low carbon products, and prices are going to go down. Now, is that going to happen soon? I doubt it. I think prices will go up higher, but we shouldn't measure the success of a program by the price. As somebody who's been involved in carbon in markets for a while, I've seen prices as high as $1 million a ton for some credits, not carbon, but other environmental credits. And that's a sign of a program that's not working. So we need to see prices only be as high as they need to be. Low prices are a signal for greater ambition. And if prices fall, that means that regulators should say, you know what, we need to reduce the cap. If prices are high in the EU ETS and regulators are wringing their hands and saying we have too many speculators, maybe what it means is that we don't have enough aggression in terms of policy. Because the best cure for high prices are high prices, because that's going to stimulate more demand for the products which are going to bring prices down. Right? So that's a different way of looking at it, maybe.
And this is why carbon pricing is a really popular and important tool, because it's really about efficiency from a societal perspective. Let's just make the price as high as it needs to be to mitigate the next ton of CO2.
Yeah.
Of greenhouse gas emissions.
And I think that's it. And I think that's also, I'm so happy you didn't get on the speaker. I thought you were going up there. But so to your point, the price should only be, as you say, it's the marginal abatement cost of carbon. And I think that's important, because we don't want carbon to be $1,000 a ton. It would be great, because we're at $45 a ton today in the fund, and that would be incredible performance. But if you go to $1,000 a ton, you stop emissions, but you also shut down the global economy, and you have no emissions because you have no industry. That's not what we want. We want to be able to have a zero emissions with infinite power and infinite electricity and water and food and all of these things. So that's the key. But this plays back into the investment thesis, which is, when I was saying asymmetric, it's asymmetric because you've almost got like a central bank function operating behind these programs. So the European Commission is managing the supply of carbon allowances so that it's at the right price in order to reduce emissions. And so today, they're bringing down the supply. They've oversupplied in the past, and there's been a glut. And that's what this, they call it the Market Stability Reserve, has been buying 24% of each auction. And so as that supply comes down, we've seen the price rising. And we've seen, and I know it's something we wanted to talk about, was the fact that the price has gone up over 100%, especially, Europe's over 130%, I think it is, in the last 12 months. So has that played out? And the answer is no. We're really just getting started. And we kind of think of the sort of $90 to $100 a ton as almost the start line, not the finish line. And as I mentioned, so Europe's kind of getting to that starting line. California is only about $30 a ton, so much cheaper. Reggie's only at $15 a ton. And so there's a long way to go in these markets to get to that price discovery where they actually start to really ratchet down emissions. So it's a tightening market. So if there's an analogy that was I think Dan had this on his slide at the beginning, was don't fight the Fed and don't fight the fundamentals, I think was the phrase. And certainly there's a Fed here, there's a tightening of these carbon markets that we're in a nice window of opportunity where these markets are tightening and the fundamentals are tightening because the supply of these is dropping while emissions are just not falling fast enough.
Yeah, it's great. It reminds me of your $1,000 a ton. Actually, Joe from Crane shared with me this week. The FT has a great carbon or climate game, where you basically get to act as God and different policy measures, and one of the things you can do is raise carbon prices to $1,000 a ton, and then you lose political support, the economy shuts down, right? And that's not what you want to do. So maybe asking you both, or whoever wants to take it, if you were God, right? God, policy God here, or the market God, from an impact perspective, how would you want to design this price over the next 10 to 20 years? Like, what would be the principles, right, that you would, what would we want to see as a society? What would we want to see from this price?
In my view, I think what we want to see as a society is we want industry to look inward before they look to the market. We want them to look at their current opportunities to reduce emissions. They should develop a marginal abatement control cost curve, considering their on-site opportunities within their Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3 emissions. They should think, what can I do on-site to reduce my emissions? At what cost? And what additional co-benefits do I get when I reduce my emissions? Co-benefits being not just reductions in carbon, but extra jobs, extra security, happier employees, an additional product that I can sell, reduction in toxics, in NOx and SOx emissions, all right? So I want them to look internally to look for reductions. I want them to make those reductions internally, unless they can get something from the marketplace that's less expensive and or that has higher co-benefits, right? So invest internally unless the market provides you with a lower cost alternative. Conversely, they should go to the marketplace when the marketplace provides them with a better investment. And I want the regulators to say, you know what, I want to encourage industry to invest in the long term. So we're not just looking for 1 or 2 years at a time. One of the most successful programs, emissions trading programs, is the acid rain program, and it allowed industries to invest for 30 years. And it provided very stable rules and regulations. So if we have stable rules and regulations, industry will make investments.
And that, and that's such an interesting thing about a carbon price is actually the current price is important in terms of driving current action, but just as important is the forward price curve and the expectation of the forward price curve to affect capital expenditure decisions, right? So that's really important. What I might say is what we want is the price to go up fairly gradually over time. I mean, increasing slope as we approach critical, which we are approaching, sort of critical and urgent, acute, challenges within a fairly, within a band, but keep the price above a minimum threshold. And we're seeing that in Europe with the MSR, and we're seeing that in California. Right, it's, there's a auction reserve price which acts as a sort of soft floor, which goes up inflation plus 5%. I mean, what other market has that kind of bottom?
I actually think that is the, if you're the sort of, as a god, you'd be a pretty weak god if all you can do is tweak policies. But if you would, I would add in. I love the California. Has a base price, a reserve price goes up 5% plus inflation, so it's going up 12%, give or take at the moment. That should be much, I think that's the adjustment. That's what I hope California actually does, is ratchets that up much closer to the market price. And actually, therefore, they're not really playing God in changing the price, but they're putting a threshold not that far below today's price that they won't auction anymore. So I think all the programs, they can learn from each other. I think the Market Stability Reserve is great in Europe. I think the rising reserve price in California is really strong. But I think it's really the magic bullet is bringing the capital markets and regulation together, and you need more of both. The regulation needs to be stronger because you need to have these programs covering all markets, and then you have to have capital coming in, which is where the conversation we had earlier about ESG, where you need to start changing behavior so that companies, and we're seeing this, but companies not just abide by the rules and buy their carbon offsets that incentivizes them to invest in greener technologies, but actually have them offsetting at the same time. They need to offset with actual carbon capture, and that can be industrial carbon capture, which hasn't quite been figured out yet, or it can be the growing of trees, the saving of trees. So the urgency can't be overstated enough. We need to act and do it with regulation and with capital flows.
So I want to come to the offsets in a second. You mentioned it. CraneShares launched a fund yesterday, KSET. But it's a great, so back to just the allowance market, let's say the compliance market, and maybe it's worth unpacking that, but great story, right? We know there's great impact story. We've got a sort of floor price. We've got this carbon short squeeze. Carbon last year, carbon pricing up over 100%, one of the best performing commodities if you consider this a commodity. Let's talk about risk though. What are the risks? We get asked about things like technological innovation. If there's huge technological innovation, is that a risk? We get asked about policy and price of electricity, for example, in Europe. I mean, what are the risks here in this market? What could, maybe?
Yeah, and so I think, in both, right? So in the compliance markets, your risk is political backpedaling. And I see that's a huge, if that happened, that would be a huge impact, but I think it's a low chance of happening. So when you sort of adjust for those two factors, I think it's a relatively low risk. But the higher energy prices are, the more stressed, the global economy is, that raises its head a little more, and that kind of increases as a risk. And that is that if governments that are supporting these programs start to lose support for these programs, it could really undermine them. So I think that's a big risk if it happened, but I think that Europe, which is the biggest program, has been so clear post-Russian invasion. Everybody thought is this going to happen? Are we going to backpedal on climate because we're going to be focused on energy security? And Europe's been really clear and come out in 3 separate votes of the European Commission, of the various different groups that oversee the program, and all have recommitted to the 55% reduction, to the market stability reserve, and so on. So I think the political risk is relatively low, but we have to. It's something that we have to be aware of. It's a risk. The other one is, like you say, technological innovation, and that is the fact that companies might actually start decarbonizing faster than the supply comes down. And so, as we said, as the price of carbon goes up, companies can keep buying them and be at risk of that price getting higher and higher and being less profitable, or they can start investing even more money in decarbonizing so they don't have to buy these ever again. And so if they do that at a faster rate than expected, we might see some price volatility because demand won't be as strong as we anticipated. But what's great about that is it means we're solving climate change a lot faster than anticipated. So that's a win. And we mentioned this kind of central bank type function. If demand's dropping too fast, which is a good thing, they can just tighten up the program and manage the process to manage that price higher to keep that momentum. So I don't really see that as a risk, but I see that as why this could be a volatile investment on its way somewhere higher. And then I'll just add one last thing on offsets, because I think it's completely different. You don't have transparent supply, and the demand's not as mandatory as it is in the compliance market. So the risk there, I think, is similar. That, well, and you know better than anybody, both of you do at Emergent, is the risk would be someone figures out carbon capture or how to scale natural solutions way more than we've ever done before. Maybe there's some way of utilizing the oceans more efficiently, whatever it is, and we actually had tons more supply, but I'm sure you can tell us why that's not so likely.
So you mentioned offsets, and I would just want to unpack just for everyone, just so we're all on the same page. The difference between regulated compliance markets, and maybe I turn Josh to you for this. The difference between regulated compliance markets and voluntary markets, and that is also the difference between allowances and offsets. Mostly, I think we've been talking about allowances in compliance markets. But if you pick up the paper and you read about carbon, you're often reading about Microsoft has made this announcement or Google has made that announcement. Typically, that's on the voluntary market. In terms of orders of magnitude, size of these markets, the compliance markets are orders of magnitude larger, right, so far. But the offset market and the voluntary market has really picked up over the last 12 to 24 months. But Josh, maybe you can unpack that a little bit. What's the difference between allowance and offset, voluntary versus compliance markets? And on the offset side, what are some of the key, bring us up to speed on what's happening on offsets. Why is there so much more demand coming in for offsets? And what's the state of the market on the offset side?
I'll do that, I promise. But let me give you a different, slightly different perspective on risk that we just talked about. And it may sound different from what Luke is saying, but I'm going to say it's going to bring us to the same point. Luke is saying that it's a small risk of regulatory risk. Having been involved in these markets for a good long time, I've seen more regulations change and affecting the marketplace than I cared to count. The regulators like to mess with markets. They like to adjust the markets so that they deliver results that they think are appropriate. They don't like markets to act like markets too much. Mary Nichols, who used to run the California Cap and Trade program, said that she's after a boring marketplace, one that kind of chugs up like this, where nothing special happens, right? But having said that, every time that I've seen, almost every time that I've seen regulators adjust markets, it has the effect of encouraging actions that you want to see. Either the markets continue, you're able to continue to invest, or they'll cut the cap, which takes away assets from sources that otherwise were keeping them for their own use. But that means that the existing credits that are in the marketplace are still valuable. And on the flip side, in terms of technology that Luke talked about, sure, you're going to see, when you see additional technologies come forward that can cause reductions to occur, it should give regulators the ambition to reduce the cap, right? So as Luke said, you want to see reductions, you want to see emissions go down, you want to see technologies advance so that you can meet your climate goals. So in terms of the allowance, the voluntary offset marketplace, one of the most, I think, stunning things that has happened over the course of the last couple of years is that you see a number of CEOs stand up and say, you know what, I recognize that I have a social license to operate, which is granted to me by the public, by the customers, based upon my ability to stand in front of them and say, I am responsible. I understand that I have effects on the environment that are beyond the product that I produce. It's the process, it's the electricity I buy, it's the products I buy, it's my supply chain, right? And they're saying, based upon the pressures that I am receiving from my children, look, or from my customers, or from the suppliers, or from my legislators, I'm going to make a commitment. I'm going to stake a flag in the sand and say, by 2030, I'm going to reduce my emissions by half. By 2050, I'm going to zero them out. Now, honestly, I think many of the CEOs who are saying this, candidly, haven't thought through this process. You know, it's a bit like, maybe I'd like to give them credit and say, like, it's a bit like the Chinese say, you cross the river by feeling for the stones. You don't know exactly how you're going to get there, right? But they're thinking that I'm going to get there. Now, what's going to be really interesting is to see what happens next year, the year after, when these goals come due by 2025, by 2030. How you doing? Are you reducing your emissions like you said you are? Oh, you're not. Well, you better, your credibility is on the line. So you may not have understood what you committed to in advance, but you're stuck with what you said because there's a videotape of you saying exactly what you're going to say. And though you may see the voluntary market is a fraction of the compliance market, I think you're going to see an increasing level of importance placed upon the voluntary offsets. And over time, there should be, not too bold a prediction, a merging of the voluntary and the compliance markets, whether it's actual fact, where the regulators regulate the voluntary market, or in fact, the customers are saying, I need to have high quality, which is going to be delivered, and I'll judge whether or not it's quality or not, and I'll let you know by whether or not I continue to buy your product.
I couldn't agree more. Luke, last question, I think we'll turn to audience questions, but maybe you can talk about, from an investor's perspective now, and looking at the suite now of carbon and ETFs at Crane Shares, right? How should investors think about exposure to carbon pricing, both on the allowance side and the offset side?
Yeah. Well, I mean, so we have a full suite. So we have, KLBN's the global product. It's got, 60% Europe, 30% California, 5% UK, 5% Reggie. So it's a really nice basket. And people always ask, I think I like California most because I think it's got more upside short term. And then people talk about Europe and say, well, I like that most because it's the most liquid and it's the strongest. And I go through that thought process as well. And I always come back to 60-30 actually is quite a good split. So let's the original idea from day one. But we do offer, the Europe and the California separately if people want to dial one up. So I like KLBN as the benchmark, and by all means add some extra California or extra Europe with the others. The offsets coming into play is really interesting because, as you mentioned, just to put some numbers, I think offsets, we're talking about $1 billion of trading over a year. The compliance markets traded nearly $700 billion last year. So is that the ratio? Definitely not, because to your point, offsets have to either converge or they're going to be a bigger part of the story. So compliance markets have been around for over 10 years, or much longer even, depending on if you're looking at Europe. But so it's about, I think the right way to sort of think about this is importance and growth of those markets. And I think probably you're somewhere sort of, I don't know, you may disagree, but I see the compliance markets, even though they're much bigger, also more mature, and they've developed more. So I think there's some, maybe it's more like a 65 to compliance markets, 35 to the offset markets, because these markets are growing and very dynamic at the moment. So we're very early in offsets, but I think this is where people
Where
need
are
to
you
start.
seeing investors from a portfolio
Oh, in a
allocation?
portfolio allocation.
Yeah.
So it's interesting. So people have looked at it almost like a commodity replacement. We talked a little bit before about commodities are not clean, and a lot of ESG portfolios have picked up carbon as the natural alternative bucket for their ESG portfolio. And then we talk to those same clients. We say, well, why do you only have this in your ESG portfolios? Do your other investors not like low correlations, downside protection built into the, what else has that? So we've seen people use it like that. So we've seen people, we've also seen people sort of funding it from equities, where they think about, is this actually an equity hedge? As the price of carbon rises, that's a drag on nearly every global company. And so we were actually working on some ratio where if you're long equities, which everybody is, how much carbon do you need to just offset? What's your baseline carbon exposure you need? So I think every portfolio needs it. And it could be, so I think it's a very natural alternative, very naturally sits near commodities, although it's not commodity. And as I said, people are adding it as a complement to equities.
I know drinks are waiting, and the three of us now, having know these guys pretty well. If you don't bring out the hook, we'll keep going here for another few hours. But let me turn and see if there are questions, audience questions, or any questions online. Again, info@craneshares.com if there are questions coming in online. I think everybody wants a drink.
Great, let's get to the drink.
All right. Well, hey, look. Any question, Bill? No. So, I just want to thank both Josh and Luke for a great panel. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And I'm going to turn this over.
I'm just going to
go ahead, Bill.
real quick. Thanks, everybody. Really appreciate you joining us. I'm not going to hold you away from the drinks any longer. Cocktails in the room behind you. Please stick around if you can. Thanks.
Thanks.